Today we continue with our reading from the book of Genesis. And today we get the first meal or the first supper that occurs in the scriptures in the book of Genesis. And it's quite interesting, the language used at the first supper is modelled with the language that's used at the Last Supper. According to a number of scholars, the New Testament writers intentionally use the same language that was used at the First Supper, which we heard today from the book of Genesis, in the language of the Last Supper, creating this link, this bridge between these two events. The Last Supper, as we refer to it, brings an end to the impact of what happens at that First Supper. The First Supper, Adam and Eve take, we're told. They break, they eat, they give. At the Last Supper, Jesus takes the bread and the wine. He breaks the bread. He gives it to the disciples and they eat. Exactly the same language. At the First Supper, the one we heard today of Adam and Eve, it brings isolation. It brings separation. They want to hide themselves from God. It brings death. It brings destruction. The Last Supper brings an end to all of this. When we receive communion, we're bringing Jesus into us. We can't hide from God. Jesus comes and dwells within us. And so the impact of that First Supper is reversed with what happens at the Last Supper. The impact of sin, of death, destruction, of isolation, of making ourselves God is replaced with what happens at the Last Supper, where we bring God into us. That we want relationship, that we want life. Jesus says that if you eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, you will live forever. Adam and Eve ate at the First Supper and it brought death. It brought destruction. It brought bitterness and unhappiness. At the Last Supper, it brings communion. It brings oneness. It brings eternal life. It's this beautiful link between the two. Often when I talk about this, people have thought, well, why have we never heard this? I'm not entirely sure why we haven't heard this. It has been part of our tradition going back actually hundreds and over 1,000 years. This link between the First Supper and the Last Supper. To understand the Last Supper, we need to understand what happened at that First Supper. And the language that we have clearly creates this bridge between the two of them. Eve took some of the fruit, she ate it, and she gave some also to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. The Jewish people, when they heard these words, when it was spoken of Jesus in the New Testament, they knew these patterns of words, and they knew that it created this link to this First Supper. Jesus uses exactly the same words, and we hear this every time we come to Mass. Let's cherish what happens at the Last Supper that we are participating in. It brings an end to sin. It gives us new life. It brings us not in separation from God, but it brings us into complete communion of oneness with God. Let us treasure and love this great gift of the Eucharist.